It was still early morning when I heard the distant sound of my miniature pony, Biscuit, making anxious noises. Without a moment's hesitation, I jumped out of bed, barely noticing that I was still in my chicken print pajamas. As I sprinted across the muddy yard, panic surged in my chest. I had a bad feeling. Rounding the corner of my barn, I froze. A huge tow truck with the words County Enforcement painted on its side was backing up toward my property. My heart raced. Who shows up at someone's farm at 7 a.m. without any warning? "Hey, stop right there," I yelled, nearly slipping as I rushed toward the truck, my mind racing. The three figures in matching navy polos turned around, the woman in front looking at me with a cool, judgmental expression. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the gusting wind, and she clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon. "You must be Sarah Harper," she said, her eyes sweeping over me as if I was some kind of mess in my pajamas. "I'm Judith Mercer, president of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. You've ignored our notices for 3 months." I blinked, still confused. "Notices? What notices? I don't belong to any HOA. My family has owned this farm for over 40 years. Judith's fake smile didn't even reach her eyes. "The county rezoned this entire area last quarter. Your property is now part of our community. This means you must follow our rules." She handed me a thick envelope. My stomach dropped as I opened it. Inside, there was a bill for $2,300 in back dues, along with a notice that all farm animals must be removed immediately. My heart sank as I scanned the document. This couldn't be real. "This is ridiculous," I protested, stepping forward. "You can't just decide my farm belongs to your fancy neighborhood. I was here first." Judith's smile remained cold and insincere. "Actually, we can," she said, a tall man in an expensive suit stepping forward from behind the tow truck. "I'm Tyler Mercer, Willow Creek Development LLC," he introduced himself, unfolding a map. "The county commissioners approved our petition to incorporate all properties within these boundaries." He pointed to a large map showing my 5-acre farm, now surrounded by their development. It hit me. My farm was now an island in a sea of newly built houses. Houses that wanted nothing to do with the sight or smell of real farm animals. "You can't do this. I've had animals here for years," I shouted, stepping back in disbelief. "Actually, we can," Tyler said again, his voice cool and businesslike. "The county's rezoning process was approved. Now you must comply." I could hardly breathe. My farm wasn't just a patch of land anymore. It was surrounded by luxury homes, each built to push my way of life out of existence. Judith held up another paper. "This is your final warning regarding unauthorized livestock," she said, checking off items on her clipboard. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as she explained that they had the authority to remove all my animals. "This is insane," I muttered under my breath, my hands shaking. I felt helpless as the workers moved toward my barn, where my 6 rescue chickens, 3 goats, and 2 miniature ponies lived. I couldn't let them take my animals. Rusty, my dog, started barking frantically. He sensed something was wrong, and I rushed to block the barn door with my body. "You can't take my animals. That's stealing," I cried out. Judith, without a hint of sympathy, handed me another paper with a county seal. "This order authorizes the removal of prohibited livestock. You can retrieve them from the county facility once you pay your outstanding fines." I scanned the paper. It all looked real. Signed by Commissioner Phillips. How could this be happening? How had I gotten caught up in this web of corruption? "I'm calling the sheriff," I said, my voice trembling as I pulled out my phone. Tyler smirked. "Go ahead. The sheriff's department is aware of today's enforcement action." Within 20 minutes, Sheriff Jenkins arrived. I explained the situation, hoping he could stop the madness. But when he looked at the papers, he simply shook his head. "Sorry, Sarah, but the paperwork seems in order. The county did rezone this area. There's nothing I can do officially right now." I couldn't believe my ears. Sheriff Jenkins had known me for years. How could he just stand there and do nothing? "Tom, you've known me since high school. These animals are my life," I protested. "Get proper legal advice," he said quietly, his voice low as he turned and walked back to his car. It was over. My animals were being taken away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Meanwhile, the workers had already loaded my chickens into cages, and my oldest goat, Mabel, was pulled from the barn, crying out in fear. I was helpless, watching as my beloved animals were driven away in trucks, leaving my barn empty and silent. Judith handed me another paper with an invoice for $4,500 in violations, which I had to pay within 2 weeks to avoid a lien on my property. My hands shook as I clutched the bill. How was I supposed to come up with that kind of money? I watched, feeling utterly defeated, as the trucks disappeared down the road. Tyler was snapping photos of my property from different angles, a satisfied smirk on his face. Something was off. They weren't just trying to make me join their HOA. They were trying to force me out of my family's land. I couldn't sleep that night. My barn, where my animals had always lived, echoed with silence. I kept hearing the faint bleats of my goats, the soft whinny of Biscuit, and the clucking of my chickens in my mind. But all that was left was the empty space, the cold wooden walls that had once been filled with life. Rusty, my dog, wandered the property in confusion, sniffing at the places where my animals used to be. He circled the barn several times, whining softly as if he, too, knew something was wrong. I sat on the porch, my hands tightly gripping the railing, trying to come to terms with what had happened. How had they gotten away with this? They couldn't just take my animals and force me to pay a fine that I couldn't afford. There had to be something I could do. But what? I couldn't just sit back and let them steal everything my family had worked for. I had to find out how they had done this, how they could get away with it. The next morning, I drove to the county animal facility where my animals were being held. The building was cold and sterile, the smell of bleach and disinfectant making my stomach turn. The receptionist was a young woman, indifferent to my presence, but I forced a smile. "I'm here about the animals that were brought in yesterday from Willow Creek," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She typed something into her computer and then looked back at me. "Harper Animals, yes, we have them. The release fee is $4,500 plus $75 per day boarding charges. That brings your total to $4,500 right now." My breath caught in my throat. "What? $4,500? She nodded, seemingly unfazed. "That's the fee. If you want to pick them up, you need to pay it." I was speechless. That was all my emergency savings. Everything I had set aside in case of an emergency. They were counting on me not having enough money to get my animals back. This wasn't about rules. This was about breaking me financially. "Can I at least see them?" I asked, my voice cracking. The clerk nodded and led me to a viewing area. My heart broke as I saw my animals in their tiny pens. Biscuit, my arthritic pony, was unable to even turn around in the cramped space. Mabel, my oldest goat, kept bleating in distress, looking lost and scared. They needed space. They needed proper care, not these cramped cages meant for dogs and cats. "These are farm animals, not pets," I protested, my voice rising. "They need proper housing." "Not my department," the clerk replied flatly, shrugging her shoulders. "They'll be put up for adoption in 14 days if fees aren't paid." I felt the ground slip out from under me. They were trying to force me to abandon my animals, to let them be sold off to people who wouldn't care for them the way I did. I had to get them back. But how? I left the facility, my hands trembling, feeling utterly helpless. The only thing I knew for sure was that this wasn't about following the rules. It was about something bigger, something far more sinister. I could feel it in my gut. I spent the rest of the day researching online, trying to understand how this could be legal. It wasn't just about animals or fines. It was about my land, my family's land. The more I dug, the more I realized something wasn't right. Late that afternoon, I made my way to the county records office. I needed to see the zoning documentation for Willow Creek Estates. The clerk there was a middle-aged woman who looked up with a raised eyebrow when I requested the documents. "That's quite a lot of paperwork," she said, surprised. "I've got time," I replied, settling into a chair with a notebook and pen. 3 hours later, I found something strange. The rezoning petition for the area around Willow Creek Estates had been submitted just 6 months ago, but the official notifications were dated only 3 weeks back. That was far too late for proper community input. It didn't make sense. Even more suspicious was the fact that Commissioner Phillips had fast-tracked the approval process. There had been concerns raised by county staff about environmental impacts, but those concerns had been ignored. I photographed everything I could with my phone. As I left the records office, my mind was racing. Something was terribly wrong, and I was starting to see a pattern, one that linked Tyler Mercer's development company with the county commissioners. This was no ordinary rezoning case. This was a land grab. I had to act fast. If they could manipulate the system like this, what else were they capable of? What were they planning to do next? The truth was starting to come into focus, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what I was about to uncover. By the time I got home, it was dark. I pulled into the driveway, but something felt off. There, parked on the street, was Judith's car, her perfect bob haircut barely visible through the window. She was watching my property, taking notes. She'd been here, spying on me. I rushed inside and called my old high school friend Emma, who worked at the local newspaper. "Emma, you won't believe what's happening. They're trying to take my farm, the whole thing. This isn't just about the HOA. This is a land grab." Her voice was sharp, concerned. "This sounds serious, Sarah. Let me poke around. This might be bigger than just your farm. I'll get back to you soon." That night, as I tried to make sense of everything, there was a knock at the door. An elderly woman stood on the other side, looking nervous but determined. "I'm Eleanor Jenkins," she said, introducing herself. "I live in the new development across the way. I saw what they did to your animals. It's not right." I invited her in, surprised. "What do you mean?" Eleanor explained that she had bought her home a year ago, lured in by the promise of pastoral views overlooking farmland. But now the entire neighborhood was controlled by the Mercer family. The HOA was becoming more and more oppressive, and Eleanor had overheard a conversation between Tyler Mercer and Judith, where Tyler had mentioned using the farm's land to build more luxury homes. "They want your land, Sarah," Eleanor said quietly. "It's not about the animals or the rules. It's about your farm." Everything started to click into place. They weren't just harassing me about rules. They were trying to force me out, and they would do anything to make it happen. That night I stayed up, organizing the documents I'd found, piecing together the truth. This wasn't just an issue with zoning laws or HOA violations. It was a full-blown scheme to take my family's land and turn it into luxury homes. I had to expose them before it was too late. The next morning I barely slept a wink. The weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come pressed down on me. My family's land wasn't just a piece of property, it was our heritage. The Mercer family and their development company had been methodically pushing everyone out, and now they were coming after me. I needed to expose them, but I had to move carefully. One wrong move, and they could destroy everything. I couldn't sit around anymore. I had to act fast. I decided to return to the county records office. I was sure there had to be something in the paperwork that could give me an edge. Maybe a missing document or a procedural mistake they'd overlooked. I needed leverage. I spent the morning going through files, scrutinizing every detail I could find. There, buried in the middle of a folder, I found it, a crucial piece of information. The rezoning petition, although dated 6 months ago, had been submitted with a specific clause that should have triggered a public hearing. This clause, meant to ensure transparency and community involvement, had been completely bypassed. There were no public notices, no open forums, and no opportunity for residents to voice their concerns. My heart raced as I read through the documents. It was all laid out so clearly. They had skipped all the necessary steps, forcing the rezoning approval through with the help of Commissioner Phillips, who had signed off on everything. And then it hit me. There was something worse in the paperwork than just procedural issues. Commissioner Phillips, the man who had expedited this rezoning process, had received significant campaign contributions from Tyler Mercer's development company. In fact, the amounts were so large they couldn't possibly be a coincidence. I quickly snapped pictures of the documents and made a mental note to follow up on everything when I could. I couldn't let this go. There was clear evidence of corruption, something that needed to be exposed. But how? I was beginning to piece together a disturbing picture. Tyler Mercer wasn't just a developer. He was a man who had used his wealth and influence to manipulate the system, all to acquire land at bargain prices. His company had surrounded my farm with cookie-cutter houses, but that wasn't enough. Now he wanted my property for phase 2 of his development, a luxury lakeside community where my farm stood. The lake was the centerpiece, and my farm was in the way. But there was more. As I left the county records office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something even more sinister was happening right under my nose. Tyler Mercer was orchestrating the destruction of my life, and the more I looked, the more it seemed like they'd thought of everything. When I got back to my farm, I found something unexpected waiting for me. There was a landscaping truck parked in my driveway. 3 workers were measuring my front yard, marking up sections of my land as if it was theirs to do with as they pleased. I approached them, heart pounding. "What are you doing on my property?" I demanded, my voice barely holding back my anger. One of the workers handed me a sheet of paper. "HOA pre-approved landscaping assessment," he said, pointing to the document. "It says here your vegetation needs removal. You're not in compliance with the standards." I took the paper from his hand, furious. "I haven't authorized any work. Get off my property." They hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other before getting into their truck and driving off. As the truck pulled away, I noticed Judith's car down the street, parked at an angle that made it clear she was watching, taking notes, documenting more violations. I wanted to shout at her, but instead I took a deep breath. I was done being pushed around. I wasn't going to let them take my property, my animals, and my future. But I needed more than just anger. I needed evidence. And for that, I needed help. I called Emma, my old high school friend who worked at the local newspaper. I explained everything: the rezoning, the bribery, the way the Mercers were systematically targeting me and everyone else around me. She listened carefully, taking notes. "This sounds fishy, Sarah," she said. "I'll see what I can dig up. This might be bigger than just your farm. I'll call you back soon." I hung up the phone and stood in the yard, staring at my barn and the wide-open fields beyond it. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, this place had felt like home. Now it felt like a battleground. But I couldn't let the Mercers win. This was my family's legacy. I had to protect it. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and trying to find anyone who could help me. Eleanor, my elderly neighbor, came by to check on me. She had heard whispers of other residents being targeted by the HOA for trivial violations, bird feeders being too high, fences painted the wrong color, and more. People were fed up, but they were afraid to speak out. They were afraid of the Mercers and their iron grip on the HOA. Eleanor wasn't the only one who came by. As word spread about my fight, other neighbors began to reach out, each with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. One by one, they shared their experiences. The Mercers had been slowly but surely tightening their control over Willow Creek Estates, using the HOA to break people financially, forcing them into compliance, and threatening anyone who spoke out. It became clear that this wasn't just about my farm, it was about all of us. The Mercers were trying to buy out an entire community. That evening, Eleanor and I sat in my kitchen, going over everything I had uncovered. Jackson, her grandson, who was studying law at the local university, had agreed to take a look at the documents. He was shocked when he saw how many legal violations there were, from improper notice of zoning changes to procedural errors in the formation of the HOA itself. "This is ridiculous," he said, flipping through the HOA bylaws. "They violated at least 7 procedural requirements in forming the HOA, and the environmental impact assessment for the rezoning never even happened. They filed paperwork saying it did, but there's no record of it." I nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. "We can fight back, but we need to get the word out. I'm not the only one they have targeted." That's when the plans started to come together. Eleanor's grandson, Jason, knew some attorneys who would take our case pro bono. One was a well-known local lawyer who had been involved in environmental law cases before. The other was a criminal defense lawyer who had experience with corruption cases. Together, they would help us gather the necessary evidence and file for an injunction to stop the Mercers in their tracks. But before we could do that, we needed to get our story out. And for that, we needed the media. That night, I sent Emma a detailed account of everything that had happened, along with copies of the zoning documents, the campaign donation records, and everything I had found. I included the stories from my neighbors, all of them detailing the illegal tactics Tyler Mercer had used to manipulate the system. "Get this out there, Emma," I wrote. "We need people to see what's happening here. We need to expose them before they can do any more damage." The next morning, I received a call from Emma. "I've got something for you," she said, her voice excited. "I think you're going to want to hear this." I sat down, heart racing. It was time to take the fight to them. The call from Emma came just as I was about to step out the door. My heart skipped a beat when I heard her voice on the other end of the line. "I've got something for you," she said, her tone filled with excitement. "Get ready. This is going to shake things up." I gripped the phone tightly, not sure whether to be anxious or hopeful. "What do you mean? What did you find?" "Everything you've been digging into? It's worse than you thought. I've got confirmation that Tyler Mercer and Commissioner Phillips have been in cahoots for months. They've been planning this land grab, and I've got the proof to back it up." I felt a rush of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the tension that followed. This was the break I needed, but it wasn't enough. We needed more. We needed the whole community to stand up and speak out. "You've got the proof?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "I've got text messages, emails, and even recordings of meetings where they discussed the whole scheme. I'm putting it all together into an expose. I'll have it ready by the end of the day. But there's more." I felt a surge of anticipation. More? What else? "The Mercers didn't just target your farm. I've tracked down other residents who've been hit with absurd fines and violations. They've been pushing people out one by one. But here's the kicker. They've been lying about the environmental impact of their lake. There's no way they can build it without destroying local wetlands. I've already reached out to a few environmental agencies. They're interested." I couldn't believe it. All this time I had suspected that they were up to something bigger, and now Emma had the proof. It wasn't just about my farm. It was about every single person they'd been squeezing for money, every small piece of land they'd acquired with lies and manipulation. "I don't know how to thank you," I said, my voice shaking with gratitude. "Just make sure this goes public, Sarah. We have to stop them before they do any more damage." That was all the motivation I needed. I knew this was just the beginning of the fight. But with Emma's article in the works, the tide was about to turn. I spent the rest of the day preparing. Jackson, Eleanor's grandson, worked tirelessly to organize all the legal documents and put together the strongest possible case. We knew we had enough evidence to make a compelling argument, but we needed to keep the pressure on. The Mercers would do everything they could to fight back, but they weren't expecting the community to rise up against them. By evening, the article was ready. Emma had outdone herself. She had linked the corruption in the rezoning process, the bribery between Tyler Mercer and Commissioner Phillips, and the false environmental assessments. The headline read, "Willow Creek Corruption Exposed, Developer and Local Officials Linked to Land Grab Scheme." Under the headline, a smaller subheading read, "Investigative Report Reveals Fraudulent Practices to Push Out Longtime Residents for Profitable Development." I could barely believe it. I knew that once the article hit, it would be like throwing a stone into a calm pond. The ripples would reach far and wide. The first thing I did was call Margot, the investigative reporter who had helped me earlier. "Margot, it's happening," I said, my voice full of urgency. "The article's ready. Emma's got everything. We're exposing them." "That's fantastic, Sarah. I'll be at the paper first thing in the morning to make sure they push it out. This could be the start of the end for the Mercers," she replied. My pulse quickened. This was the moment I had been waiting for. But the question still lingered. Would it be enough? Would the community finally see the Mercers for what they really were? The following day, as soon as the article went live, the phone calls started pouring in. Friends, neighbors, even strangers reached out to offer support. People were angry. They couldn't believe what had been happening right under their noses. Eleanor and I made our rounds, knocking on doors and speaking to anyone who would listen. The news was spreading like wildfire. There were more people in Willow Creek Estates who had been affected by the Mercers' shady dealings than I had ever imagined. One by one, they came forward, sharing their stories of unfair fines, violation notices, and the crushing pressure to comply with unreasonable HOA demands. By that afternoon, the local news stations were picking up the story. Margot had done her job well, and now the public was demanding answers. I felt a small spark of hope, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. That night, as I sat on the porch of my farm, watching the sunset, I reflected on everything that had happened. My animals were still in the county facility, but they were safe for now. Eleanor had found a nearby farm willing to take them temporarily. The community was rallying behind me, and I could feel the tide turning. But I also knew the Mercers wouldn't back down easily. They had too much power, too much money invested in this development. and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Suddenly, headlights illuminated the driveway. My heart skipped a beat as I stood up, wondering if they were coming after me again. But it wasn't the Mercers. It was my neighbors, people who had heard the news and come to offer their support. There was Harold, the man who had been secretly recording the HOA meetings, Rachel, the young mother who had been fined for the height of her bird feeder, and even Martin, the retired teacher who had taken over as the new representative for the neighborhood. Together, we sat around the kitchen table, discussing our next steps. We formed the Willow Creek Property Rights Alliance, a group dedicated to exposing the Mercers' corruption and protecting our community from their influence. "We're not just fighting for your farm, Sarah," Martin said, looking at me with determination. "We're fighting for all of us." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. We had a plan, we had the evidence, and we were finally fighting back. The Mercers had underestimated us. They had thought we were easy targets, but they were wrong. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about all of us, our homes, our land, and our right to live without fear of being pushed out for profit. As the night wore on, we began to make preparations. We knew it wasn't going to be easy, but we were ready. The battle for Willow Creek had just begun, and we were going to win. The next day, we filed for an injunction against the HOA's illegal actions. It was time to take the fight to court, and this time, we had the truth on our side. The morning after we formed the Willow Creek Property Rights Alliance, we took our first major step toward exposing the Mercers. The injunction was filed, and I felt a mixture of hope and anxiety swirl inside me. We had the truth, the support of our neighbors, and the legal ground to stand on. But the Mercers were powerful. Their influence was wide-reaching, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Over the next few days, we gathered evidence, made plans, and coordinated with the attorneys. Jackson had helped us find two pro bono lawyers, one with experience in environmental law and the other specializing in real estate and land use. Together, they were a formidable team, but even they knew this battle wouldn't be easy. The first hearing came quickly. The courtroom was packed with the residents of Willow Creek Estates who had come to support us, their faces tense with anticipation. Eleanor, Rachel, Harold, and Martin sat with me, their presence a reminder of why we were fighting. We weren't just fighting for my farm, we were fighting for every single person who had been wronged by the Mercers and their HOA. As we sat in the courtroom, I couldn't help but glance nervously at the other side. Tyler Mercer was sitting with his lawyer, a smug look on his face as he whispered something to his attorney. Judith sat next to him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression one of icy control. She didn't seem concerned, not in the slightest, but I knew that if we could expose their corruption, if we could make them answer for their actions, it would all come crumbling down. The judge walked in, and the room fell silent. "Today, we are here to review the request for an injunction filed by the Willow Creek Property Rights Alliance," the judge announced, her voice calm but firm. "The petitioners have requested that all actions taken by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association be temporarily halted until further review due to procedural violations and potential fraud. We will begin with the petitioner's case." Our attorney stood up, ready to present our evidence. Jackson, though still in his second year of law school, had a sharp mind and had helped organize our case in ways I could never have done alone. He had been working tirelessly alongside the other lawyers to prepare. The first attorney, Rachel's contact, spoke up. "Your Honor, we are here today because the homeowners in Willow Creek Estates have been targeted by an unlawful HOA formed with procedural violations that were never disclosed to the community. The rezoning process itself was rushed and bypassed public hearings, depriving local residents of their right to be heard. We have evidence that the Mercer family and Commissioner Phillips have been directly involved in manipulating the system to force property owners out and take their land for development." He presented the documents that Emma had uncovered, the text messages, emails, campaign donations, and the proof that Tyler Mercer's development company had been working hand in hand with Commissioner Phillips to fast-track the rezoning. I watched as the judge took notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The second attorney, a real estate expert, spoke next. "Additionally, the environmental impact study required by law has not been conducted. We have testimony from local environmental experts that confirms the proposed artificial lake would significantly damage the local wetlands, an area that is protected under county and state regulations. This violates both state and federal laws. I felt a small surge of hope. It wasn't just about the corruption and manipulation, it was about the environment too. These weren't just violations of zoning laws. The Mercers were putting the entire community and the land at risk. Tyler Mercer's lawyer stood up to object. Your Honor, the petitioners are simply grasping at straws. This is a baseless case designed to delay the development process. We have followed all legal procedures, and the rezoning was approved by the County Commission. The residents have had ample time to comply with the HOA regulations. Any claims of fraud or corruption are nothing more than hearsay. The judge didn't seem convinced. She didn't give them an inch, allowing our attorneys to continue presenting evidence. After what felt like hours, the judge finally spoke. Based on the evidence presented today, I am granting the petitioners an emergency injunction, she said. All enforcement actions taken by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association are hereby temporarily suspended. This includes the removal of animals from properties and any fines issued. The court will conduct further investigation into the allegations of fraud and corruption. This matter will be set for a full hearing in the coming weeks. I could barely believe what I was hearing. We had won the injunction. The Mercers' actions were now on hold, and we had time to investigate further. The room erupted in quiet cheers from the residents who had come to support us. I saw Eleanor, Rachel, and Harold exchanging smiles, their faces filled with relief, but Tyler Mercer's face had drained of color. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath as he stood up, his lawyer following him quickly out of the courtroom. I knew that this was just one battle won. The fight was far from over, but it felt like a turning point. We had made it clear that we weren't going to back down. The next few weeks were filled with strategy sessions, interviews with local media, and more digging into the Mercers' shady dealings. The local news stations picked up the story, and public support for our cause grew stronger. People who had once been afraid to speak out now joined our alliance. Neighbors who had been targeted by the HOA for trivial violations were ready to testify. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that I needed to solve: the fate of my animals. I couldn't let them stay in the county facility any longer. The longer they were there, the more damage the Mercers could do to me. I knew I had to get them back. With the injunction in place, I went to the county animal facility. I brought the court documents, the injunction order, and a check for the release fees. The clerk, who had seemed so indifferent before, now looked guilty as she processed the payment. I'm sorry about all of this, she said, glancing at the papers. I wish we could have done more to help. I didn't respond. I just wanted my animals back. As I walked through the doors of the facility, I saw Biscuit first. His coat looked dull, his usual energy replaced with a quiet sadness. But when he saw me, his eyes lit up, and he nuzzled my arm as if he knew he was finally going home. I hugged him tightly, feeling the familiar warmth of my pony, and then I moved on to the others: Mabel, my old goat, the chickens, and Rusty, who had been there all along. They were finally free. I could bring them home. When I arrived back at my farm, the community was waiting for me. The animals were back where they belonged, and the property was full of life again. We had won a small victory, but the real fight was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. The legal battle wasn't over, but the first step was taken. My animals were back home, and Willow Creek Estates, once a place of tension and fear, was slowly turning into a community that stood together. The Mercers had been exposed, but they still had their claws in the land and the power. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about reclaiming our right to live freely without fear of being pushed out for profit. The injunction had bought us time, and the full hearing was scheduled for several weeks later. During that time, we focused on rallying more support. Our community, once divided, was now united. Neighbors who had felt alone, isolated by the oppressive HOA rules, came together. Eleanor, who had been so quiet and reserved in the past, became a leading voice in our cause, educating others about their rights and how to fight back against corruption. Jackson and the pro bono lawyers worked tirelessly to prepare for the full hearing. We gathered testimonies from residents, experts, and even former employees of Tyler Mercer's development company. The more we uncovered, the more we realized the depth of their greed and manipulation. They had been systematically targeting vulnerable property owners for years, using the HOA as a tool to push people out and make way for luxury developments. Then, the day of the full hearing arrived. It was the culmination of everything we had fought for: the truth, the unity of our community, and the resilience of people who refused to let greed destroy their lives. The courtroom was packed again, this time with even more people from Willow Creek Estates, all ready to testify. The judge was no longer just concerned about the procedural violations. Now we had evidence of fraud, environmental destruction, and the exploitation of residents for financial gain. The Mercers, Tyler and Judith, had a new attorney, but it was clear they were rattled. They had underestimated the strength of the people they had tried to manipulate. The judge took all the evidence into consideration. After a long pause, she spoke. The court finds in favor of the petitioners. The rezoning process will be reversed, and all actions taken by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association are deemed unlawful. Furthermore, this case will be referred to the district attorney for further investigation into potential criminal charges related to bribery, fraud, and environmental violations. The Mercers will also be required to pay restitution to the residents who have been harmed. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It was over. The Mercers were defeated. Our community had won. The Mercers were ordered to dismantle their illegal developments, and the residents of Willow Creek Estates would regain control of their land. The HOA was dissolved, and the community could finally breathe again. As the crowd in the courtroom erupted in cheers, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was more than just the legal battle. It was a reclaiming of everything they had tried to take from us: our land, our homes, and our dignity. The lesson from the story. The story of Willow Creek Estates is more than just a tale of a small farm owner fighting against corrupt developers in a predatory HOA. It is a story about resilience, community, and standing up against forces that try to push us into silence and submission. 1. The power of community. One of the most important lessons from this story is the power of community. Alone we are vulnerable, but together we are strong. The Mercers tried to divide and conquer, but they failed because we came together, supported one another, and fought as a united front. When we stand together, we can overcome even the most powerful adversaries. 2. Don't be afraid to question authority. At every turn, the Mercers relied on their power, wealth, and connections to push through illegal actions. They believed they could intimidate us into submission. But the story shows that it's crucial to question authority when something doesn't feel right. Legal systems, environmental protections, and public oversight are there to protect people from exploitation. When we see wrongdoing, we must speak out, expose it, and demand justice. 3. Never give up, even when it feels impossible. There were many times when I felt defeated, when the Mercers' power and influence felt too overwhelming. But the lesson here is simple: never give up. Whether you're facing legal challenges, financial hardships, or a seemingly unbeatable opponent, persistence pays off. The fight may be long and the road may be hard, but if you keep pushing forward, there is always a way through. The importance of standing up for what's right. This story is about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. It wasn't just about my farm or my animals. It was about protecting the rights of everyone who had been silenced or intimidated into giving up. When we fight for what's right, we not only protect ourselves, but also pave the way for others to do the same. 5. Trust in the power of truth. Ultimately, the truth was our greatest weapon. As the evidence came to light, the corruption was exposed for all to see. No amount of money or power could shield the Mercers from the truth. In the end, truth has the power to break down walls of deceit, and no matter how deeply entrenched the corruption is, truth has a way of shining through. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset over my land, I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who believed in fairness, justice, and the strength of a community united in purpose. My animals were home, the community was free, and Willow Creek Estates was no longer a place of fear and oppression. It was a place of hope, where people stood together to protect what was theirs. And the Mercers? They had underestimated us, but we had won. and they had lost everything they had worked so hard to manipulate. The lesson was clear. Greed and corruption may seem unstoppable, but they can be defeated when people unite and stand firm.